What is up, everybody? Jeff here. Starting out the Basement Bartender series as promised with my OF content. Suckered a bunch of you into thinking I was starting an OnlyFans account, but I'm not built for that. So I'm gonna stick with what I know, which is whiskey cocktails, specifically old fashions. So today I wanted to talk about the base old fashioned. What started this idea was I took a cocktail class a couple weeks ago, at one of my favorite little speakeasy places, and just started talking with the guy. I had a ton of fun doing that, and I was like, I should teach other people how to do this as well. I've got a crazy history with whiskey. I used to run the biggest whiskey review website in the world. I was the co-founder of that, ran it for like 5 or 6 years with the team, and I amassed a pretty big collection. I think I've got like 400 bottles or so now in my little basement bar. At one point I opened up a private whiskey and wine lounge and ran that for a little while, shut it down, brought all my collection back here. And so now I don't really use the space down here unless I'm doing tastings with friends, or I come down every once in a while and make myself an old fashioned. So that's what we're gonna do tonight. We are going to make my standard old fashioned. And I've got a ton of cocktail books, and there's 100 different ways to make an old fashioned. People want to fight me. I actually almost got in a fight at a bar one time because the guy made what I learned was or is called a Wisconsin old fashioned. I don't like pulp. I don't like pulp in my orange juice. I start choking on it. So I asked this guy for an old fashioned. I should have known it was at this kind of like divey bar, but I asked for an old fashioned. He's making the thing, and then he starts muddling this orange, like literally cherry and orange, and starts muddling the shit out of it. And I was like, whoa, buddy, hey, that's gross. I don't want to do it that way. And he's like, you ordered an old fashioned. We went back and forth, and finally, after a little bit of that, almost got into a little scuffle. And I learned through him that that's how they do it in Wisconsin. And so for my Wisconsin friends, like the history of the old fashioned, I'll go into that a little bit. Early 1800s, Prohibition, before all of that stuff really. An old fashioned at its base is literally just some sort of spirit, sugar water, simple syrup we call it now, and bitters. And so, people have made it, like I said, 100 different ways over the years. The Wisconsin guys make it with brandy. Now sometimes they'll make it with bourbon. It depends on who's making it on any given day. I think the original in America was a rye base at the time, and then it's kind of, now it can be rye, it can be bourbon, it can be literally whatever you want it to be. The only thing is, as a whiskey purist and an old-fashioned purist, you got to stick with the three ingredients, right? So you've got, again, the base spirit, the simple syrup, the sugar water, whatever you want to call it, and then the bitters. So I had a buddy tonight that was making some really delicious looking drinks, but it put in, cocoa powder in and whipped cream and chocolate chips and all sorts of shit. And I was like, hey man, my whiskey purist friends, fellow like myself, that you can't call that an old fashioned. You got to name it something else. So I think he's going to call it Dale's Christmas sweater. I think you should do with that, Dale. Anyway, we'll get into it. So I am going to make my version of an old fashioned, and it's my favorite. I've made old fashions with all sorts of different spirits. I've tried Japanese whiskey. I've tried Irish. I've tried a little bit of everything. I stick with a good old fashioned bourbon. I personally love a high proof. So I go with the Old Grandad 114, which if you know, you know. It is delicious. It's fairly inexpensive. I think it's like 29 bucks a bottle here in Oregon. And the reason I go with this, not only for the flavor, first of all, the flavor profile that it has, but it's a high proof. So it's 114 proof. That's where it gets the name. And if I'm giving an old fashioned to somebody that's kind of just getting into whiskey or getting into old fashions, I will probably not use this. I want to tone it down. So in that case, typically I'll use something like Buffalo Trace. I think it's like 90 proof or 80 something, whatever it is, because that isn't gonna have that harshness to it, but it's gonna be a little sweeter. And the reason is because I like to make my own simple syrup. And so, if you go to any good whiskey bar, and this is kind of how you should know, if you're at a bar and you can just ask them, hey, what kind of simple syrup you have? And if they hold up the clear bottle of simple syrup, nothing wrong with that for like all the other drinks, all the other cocktails. But a good old-fashioned, a really good old-fashioned, they should be using Demerara. So Demerara is a type of sugar that I use. I've got my own little twist on it when I make my own at home, and I've been experimenting with some additions to that, which we'll get into in future videos. I've got like a s'mores old-fashioned that is freaking ridiculous with a custom simple syrup that I made with toasted marshmallows in it. But for now, I've got just my standard Demerara syrup here, and you know, I make this in batches, so like it's super easy to do. Basically, you just order some of the sugar if you can, or if you can get it locally. I can't seem to find it very easily here, so I order mine off Amazon. I get the big bags. I put a cup of sugar, and usually like half a cup, 3/4 of a cup of water, depending on what I'm going to use it for, and basically just bring that almost to a boil. Stir it so the sugar dissolves, and then let it cool. I put it in these containers. This one's a special one with a little pour spout, but typically that makes like 4 or 5 of those little containers about this size. So put that in the fridge. It keeps for a while. My pro tip is I add a splash of vanilla vodka in there. And people think, oh, you're doing it for the flavor, for the vanilla flavor. Now, if I want the vanilla flavor, I'll add vanilla extract. What I want, and you know, I say vanilla vodka. I'd use regular vodka if I had to, but it helps it keep it a little longer. The alcohol in there, I don't know, it's just some tip. Could totally be a wives' tale too, because somebody told me that if you put a little bit of alcohol in your simple syrup, it will help it stay a little longer. The other things we're gonna need, so we're gonna have an old-fashioned glass. The old-fashioned glass was not named after the drink. The drink, going back to the history, was because people basically were so used to it, like way back in the day, like I said, early 1800s, whenever it was. There's a lot of arguments around the date. I just say the 1800s, early, mid 1800s, whatever it was, depending on what location you're in and who's arguing who about, you know, who created the first old-fashioned. Though the name came from people going into a bar and saying, can you make me a drink the old-fashioned way? Because the old-fashioned way was, again, base spirit, simple syrup, and bitters. People started making their own concoctions, making their fruity things with all sorts of shit in it. And at some point, somebody walked into a bar and just said, this would be me, I would totally do this, walk into the bar and be like, man, I don't want all that fluffy stuff. I just want to drink the old-fashioned way. And boom, the bartender was like, all right, you want an old-fashioned? Cool, here you go. That's where the name came from. The old-fashioned glass is just named after that. I don't know. It's not like I like old crystal. The bottoms, you know, depending on if you're doing simple syrup, or some people do a sugar cube, and they'll drop a couple drops of the bitters on top of the sugar cube, and then they'll muddle that in with the whiskey. You can do it like again 100 different ways. Typically, if I'm just making one for myself, like I'm going to do tonight, I'm just going to do it in the glass. If I'm making more than one, like if I'm making a couple for some friends, if we're doing anything down here, I'll typically use mixing glass. Put all the ingredients in there, you know, stir it up, put it on the cube, whatever. Tonight, like I said, just doing it for myself, just going to make one. So I'm going to do it right in the glass. So we're going to need the whiskey we've got, the simple syrup, and then the bitters. So on the bitters, there's 1,000 different types of bitters. You go with the good old Peychaud's. There's the one with the yellow. There's Angostura, I guess it's called. So what I've done, I'm actually out of the bottle, but what I typically do, because I like to be fancy, is I use these fancy little things. And so straight, this is the Angostura, however the hell you say it. And then this is a mixture. So this is the a little bit of the Peychaud's and a little bit of the Angostura. So I have both in there. So depending on what I'm doing, and then some people like using the orange bitters. If you're doing any sort of other concoctions, we've got some black walnut bitters, dark chocolate. I'll get to that one on the next video with the s'mores, because that was part of that. So take this little rubber cap off of here. I should just get rid of these damn things because they're a pain in the ass to get on and off, but it keeps stuff from getting inside. So we've got our base spirit, our sugar, and our bitters. And so we need something to measure with. Got the little jigger thing here. So when I took this cocktail class, I learned a couple things. You know, this one's fine, but typically you do a 2 ounce. And this one is kind of annoying because it only goes up to 1.5. And so, you know, it's got graduated lines. So on this side, it's 1.5, 3/4, 1/3. On the other side, we go up to, it's 1/4, 1/2, and 1 ounce. So what I typically will do for myself, I do this to taste when I'm making my own. But if you want to stick with the actual recipe, it's 2 ounces of whatever the liquid is, your base spirit. And so what I'm gonna do first is put an ice cube in here. I'm gonna get into another video soon, barware, because these little, it's like when you're doing a barbecue, you have to click it to make sure that it works. So these things don't work worth a damn to grab ice cubes unless they're the spheres, which I will use spheres every once in a while. Tonight I just chose a plain cube. So I'm literally gonna have to grab it with my fingers. So I use crystal clear cubes. I make my own at home. Sometimes I buy them, just depends. I've done all sorts. I can do a video on the ice. I'll do that later. I've done one of those way back in the day. But we're going to put the ice in there. It's been sitting in that little cooler thing, so it's good to go. You know, you don't typically want to pull it right out of the freezer and start dumping stuff on it because it'll crack. And, then it melts a little faster. The reason we love these cubes that are crystal clear and a little bigger is because more volume on the sides. They don't melt as fast, and so it doesn't water your drink down as much. So going back into it, 2 ounces of our base whiskey. We've got uno and dos. Spilling all over the place already. That's always fun. So I'm gonna put that away. Old Granddad 114. That's the stuff the magic stuff dreams are made of. We're gonna need a measuring spoon. Some people will use this. I like to just use my spoon because I've kind of got it down to a science already. But that's what we're gonna use for our simple syrup. So I'll do that. This thing, uno and dos of those as well. And then I'm gonna put, usually for the bitters, it's to taste. I typically go with like 4 or 5 dashes of bitters, depending on which ones I'm using. Some of them are sweeter, some of them are harsh. But for base old fashioned, 4 or 5 shakes of just the straight up, I'll do 5 tonight, straight up bitters. And I'll put my little rubber cappy back on there so nothing weird gets inside. So then you can just kind of stir it in your glass. And really, that technically is an old fashioned. But now we get into all the garnishments, right? So got ourselves an orange. Some people use lemons. That's weird. I use my lemon on other drinks. But typically with an old fashioned, if you're a purist like me and most of my friends, you're just gonna slice a chunk of orange off. You're gonna expel the oils into the glass, rub the rim, and call it a day. Some people want to use cherries. There's only one brand that's good cherry, Luxardo. There's 20 other types of cherries, different brands and everything. These are my favorite. They're the best. They're kind of expensive, but they're really good. You don't have to refrigerate them. You can leave them out. Good to go. But unless I'm using a different type of simple syrup that isn't as sweet, mine's pretty sweet. If I'm using a different type, then sometimes I'll add the cherry, or if I just want some flavor, or if I'm making one for somebody that likes things a little more sweet, they're not really into whiskey yet, I'll put a cherry in there, and then with my bar spoon, I'll just put a little bit of the cherry syrup in there because it sweetens it up a little bit. So what we're gonna do with the orange is get it going here. And really, I'm trying to just get a little strip. I don't need a ton. A little strip there. Man, if I had my lighter down here, I'd do something cool. This stuff is actually flammable, which I don't know if you know that, but the oils from an orange are flammable. So when you expel, you're probably not going to be able to see this very well. It's in 4K though. When I expel the oils, I basically just squeeze the orange and it jets a bunch of the oils out. So do that a few times, try to get it all. You can twist it a little bit and then just rub it around the edge. Flavor, and then you can put it, a lot of people just put it inside. Some people throw it away. I don't really care about that. So now when I'm looking down at the ice cube, I can see all the oils floating around on top of the cube and on top of the rest of the liquid. I will usually just stir it a little bit to get that in there. Some people like leaving it so that first sip, you just get a ton of the expelled oil in there for that extra citrus blast. So that's it, man. That's an old-fashioned. That's a cocktail made the old-fashioned way, which is where the name came from again, back in the 1800s, whenever. I'm not going to argue about that. There's really been no definitive date that somebody chose. All the cocktail books agree it was just sometime in the 1800s, back in the Wild West days. So anyway, that is how I make my old fashioned. I've been told it's one of the best, one of the best around. If you ever want to try one with me, just let me know. Yeah, super good. All right, guys, that's it for this episode of the Basement Bartender. I'll catch you guys on the flip side.